The average American consumes about 17 teaspoons of added sugar every day. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 6 for women and 9 for men. Pacific. That means most people are taking in roughly double to triple the safe amount. Sugar doesn't label itself clearly. It appears under dozens of names: sucrose, dextrose, maltose, corn syrup, cane juice. It hides in bread, cane pasta sauce, in salad dressing, in granola bars, in flavored yogurt. A single container of flavored yogurt can contain more sugar per ounce than a candy bar. Pacific. 1 can of regular soda holds about 10 teaspoons, an entire day's recommended allowance in a single drink. Here is the part that should change how you think about all of this. Decades ago, someone with enormous financial stakes in keeping you uninformed quietly funded a scientific study at a major American university. That study was designed to accomplish one thing: Pacific. Shift the blame for heart disease away from sugar and onto another nutrient entirely. It worked. It was published in one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. And for 30 years afterward, doctors, governments, and food companies followed its conclusions without question. The consequences were measured in millions of lives. To understand how a single crop accumulated enough wealth and political power to bend science itself, you need to trace the full arc. And that arc stretches back about 10,000 years. Welcomest of human history, sugar was one of the rarest and most expensive substances on Earth. In the Roman Empire, Pacific, a single pound could cost a common laborer not a day, a month. Roman physicians stored it behind locked counters, right next to opium and rare imported spices. Sugar was not food, it was medicine. Pacific, prescribed for stomach ailments and eye infections, and only the wealthiest patient had biological root. Sugarcane is a tropical grass. It requires heat, humidity, and equatorial sun to grow. Pacific. You cannot cultivate it in Rome. You cannot grow it in London. You cannot plant it anywhere in Northern Europe. For Europeans, sugar was always something that came from very far away, at very great cost. Pacific. The story of how humans first found this grass starts around 8000 BC. In the tropical lowlands of New Guinea, someone pulled a tall, fibrous stalk from the ground and bit into it. Pacific. The juice delivered an intensity of sweetness unlike anything the human palate had encountered. For thousands of years after that moment, sugar remained exactly this primitive. People across New Guinea and the Pacific Islands chewed raw sugarcane for energy and pleasure. No processing, no trade, no economy built around it. Just a wild plant with a remarkable taste. Pacific. Sugarcane drifted slowly westward through Southeast Asia, island by island, generation by generation, carried by migration and early trade net. Around 3500 BC, it reached the Indian subcontinent. Pacific. Indian farmers did something that no one had attempted before: collected the juice, boiled it over open flames, and let the liquid crystallize into rough brown solids. They called this substance kunda. Pacific. The word that would eventually become candy in English. This was a genuine breakthrough. For the first time in history, sweetness could be separated from the living plant. It could be stored in clay jars, loaded onto carts, Pacific, and carried across mountain ranges to markets hundreds of miles away. India had invented sugar as a tradable, storable commodity. Ancient Indian texts describe it with something approaching reverence. Pacific. Physicians prescribed it for headaches, digestive troubles, and ailments that men preferred not to discuss openly. In this era, sugar was considered sacred. When Alexander the Great's armies reached India around 326 BC, Pacific, his soldiers encountered sugarcane for the first time. One of his officers, Nearchus, later recorded his astonishment at a grass that could produce sweetness with no involvement from bees. The Greeks, Pacific, who had only known honey as a source of sweetness, found this remarkable. But sugar remained too distant and too expensive to change anything in the Western world. It's stayed that way for centuries. Pacific. Even when small quantities finally appeared in Roman pharmacies, they were sold at prices that put sugar beyond the reach of anyone except the very wealthy. Pacific. Europe would spend nearly 1,000 years treating sugar as an exotic medicine before anything changed. Arab chemists and merchants changed that equation. During the Islamic Golden Age, roughly the 7th through 13th centuries, they transformed India's crude process into a sophisticated refining system. They developed techniques that produced sugar whiter, finer, and far more stable. They built sugar mills across Persia, Egypt, Pacific, and North Africa, and began trading refined sugar throughout the known world. When European crusaders arrived in the Levant in 1096, they tasted refined sugar for the first time and lost their composure over it. Pacific. They hauled bags of it back to Europe alongside swords and holy relics. Venice, positioned at the crossroads of East and West, captured the trade and controlled Europe's sugar supply for roughly 200 years. Pacific, generating extraordinary wealth in the process. In medieval Europe, sugar held the same cultural position that gold occupies today. Kings commissioned elaborate sugar sculptures to display at royal banquets as demonstrations of power. Pacific. The English crown maintained detailed sugar inventories with the same rigor modern governments apply to gold reserves. At Henry III's wedding in 1236, Pacific, the royal household purchased over 300 pounds of sugar for a single celebration, a sum that exceeded a knight's entire annual income. Apothecaries locked it away under their counters. If you could afford sugar, Pacific, you were part of the elite. If you could not, and the vast majority could not, you likely went your entire life without tasting sweetness beyond fruit and honey. So here is the question that should stop you cold. Today, Pacific, sugar is one of the cheapest ingredients on the planet. A 5-pound bag costs a few dollars. It fills roughly 3/4 of packaged foods on any supermarket shelf. Pacific. How did one of the most expensive substances in human history become one of the cheapest? That transformation did not come from clever agriculture or mechanical innovation. Pacific. It came from a system of forced labor, so modern world, and from a set of economic calculations so cold they still read like fiction. In the 1400s, Portugal began colonizing Atlantic islands. Madeira, Pacific, the Canaries, São Tomé off the West African coast. These islands had the perfect for sugarcane. For the first time, Europeans could grow their own supply without relying on Arab middlemen. But sugarcane farming is brutal labor. Pacific. During harvest seasons, plantations ran 18 to 20 hours a day in tropical heat. European convicts and impoverished workers were tried first. They collapsed in large numbers, unable to sustain the pace. Pacific. Portugal turned to enslaved Africans. The sugar plantations of São Tomé became the testing ground for a system of coerced labor that would soon engulf the entire Atlantic world. Pacific. Columbus carried sugarcane cotton across the ocean in 1492. The Caribbean offered ideal conditions and could never get enough. Within decades, Spain, Portugal, England, France, Pacific, and the Netherlands were racing to build sugar colonies. Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, Brazil all became machines designed for a single output. Sugar. The production process itself was dangerous at every stage. Pacific. Workers cut cane by hand with machetes under tropical sun, then fed the stalks into grinding mills that operated around the clock during harvest. The rollers could seize a hand, an arm, an entire body. Pacific. Plantations stationed as hatchets beside the mills as emergency tools for amputating a trapped limb before the machine pulled a worker through. After grinding, the juice was boiled in a series of copper kettles over roaring fires. Pacific. Each vessel hotter than the last. Temperatures in the boiling houses regularly exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns from splashing molten sugar were constant. The labor never stopped. By the 1650s, Barbados, Pacific, an island roughly the size of a mid-sized American city, was producing more sugar than all of Brazil. It was the single most valuable colony in the British Empire, worth more than every North American colony put together. Pacific. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, an estimated 12.5 million enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic. A massive number ended up on sugar plantations, Pacific, where the average life expectancy after arrival was 7 years. Plantation owners had calculated the economics. Working people to death and purchasing replacements was cheaper than providing survivable conditions. That arithmetic, Pacific, repeated systematically across centuries and continents, formed a central economic pillar of the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar was the commodity that made those numbers add up. Without its extraordinary profit margins, Pacific, the financial incentive to maintain forced labor at this scale would have been drastically weaker. By the 1700s, sugar had surpassed tobacco, cotton, and coffee as the most valuable commodity in the Atlantic trading system. Pacific. Its profits built mansions across London and Paris, equipped royal navies, and financed wars on multiple continents. The triangle trade: manufactured goods shipped from Europe to Africa, Pacific. Enslaved people shipped from Africa to the Caribbean. Sugar shipped from the Caribbean back to Europe depended on sugar revenue at every stage of the cycle. Every port along these routes took a cut of the profits, Pacific. Every investor in London or Amsterdam who funded a sugar voyage expected returns that only this one crop could deliver. In 1700, the average English person consumed about 4 pounds of sugar per year. By 1800, Pacific, that number had climbed to 18, more than quadrupling in a single century. Sugar had gone from an aristocratic luxury to a middle-class expectation, driven by deliberate commercial and political promotion. The more people consumed, Pacific, the more the colonies produced. The more the colonies produced, the more enslaved labor they demanded. Every link in this chain pulled the next one tighter. The exploitation did not stop when the plantation system finally cracked. The sugar industry simply evolved its methods. In the 20th century, it found quieter, sophisticated to protect its market, suppressing inconvenient research, shaping public perception, and keeping consumption climbing. Pacific. That part of the story is still ahead. But first you need to see how the old colonial system fell apart and what replaced it. In 1791, enslaved workers on sugar plantations in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, Pacific, launched a full-scale uprising. Hundreds of thousands rose simultaneously, burned the plantations to the ground, and took up arms against French, Spanish, and British military forces. The war lasted 12 years. By 1804, Pacific, they had won their independence. Haiti became the first nation in the Western Hemisphere founded by formerly enslaved people, and it was born directly in the cane fields that had imprisoned them. Pacific. It remains the only successful large-scale slave revolt in modern history. The revolution devastated France's sugar economy overnight. Napoleon, who had envisioned a sugar-funded empire stretching across the Americas, Pacific, was forced to abandon the plan entirely. In 1803, he sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for roughly $15 million, less than 4 cents per acre. Without the sugar revenue from Haiti, Pacific, holding that vast territory made no financial sense. The collapse of Haiti's sugar industry, pushing Napoleon toward that sale, and the transaction ultimately nearly doubled the size of the United States. Pacific. Blockaded by the British Navy and cut off from Caribbean supply, Napoleon turned to beets. A German chemist named Andreas Marggraf had discovered that common European beets contained sucrose chemically identical to cane sugar. Pacific. Napoleon invested aggressively, planting tens of thousands of acres across France and establishing dedicated research institutions. By 1813, France was producing millions of pounds of beet sugar per year. Pacific. The monopoly that tropical sugarcane had held for millennia was broken. Cane against beet, colony against homeland. This rivalry drove prices steadily downward for over a century. Pacific. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the collapse in cost. Steam-powered mills replaced animal-driven systems. Railroads moved raw cane from field to factory in hours instead of days. Pacific. Refining technology advanced until manufacturers could produce white sugar so fine it bore no resemblance to the rough brown crystals of ancient India. White sugar became a symbol of modernity. Brown sugar, Pacific, the same product with trace minerals left in, was dismissed as with tea. Britain was importing massive quantities of tea from China, but tea is bitter. Sugar transformed it. By 1850, Pacific, British workers were drinking an average of 2 sweetened cups daily. The government lowered tariffs on sugar specifically to keep the labor force energized. Pacific. Cheap sweetened tea became the lowest-cost energy source powering the factory system. 12 to 14-hour shifts sustained by sugared tea and jam on bread. Factory owners understood the arithmetic. Sugar delivered fast, Pacific, cheap calories without the expense of real meals. The Coca-Cola Company, launched in 1880 century, it was selling millions of bottles per year. Everyone loaded with sugar. Candy bars arrived on shelves. Pacific. Breakfast cereals evolved from plain oats into sugar-coated products. By 1970, the average American was consuming over 100 pounds of sugar annually, roughly 45 kilograms. Pacific. No civilization in recorded history had ever approached those numbers. If you're learning something from this, consider subscribing. World Decoded goes deep on stories like this every week. Now, Pacific. That study mentioned at the beginning of this video, the one quietly funded by an industry with billions on the line. Here is the full story. By the 1950s, Pacific. Internal research at major sugar companies had identified clear links between high sugar consumption and heart disease. They possessed the evidence. They chose to bury it. In 1967, Pacific, the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 Harvard researchers, the equivalent of roughly $50,000 in today's money, to produce a literature review. That review systematically minimized evidence connecting sugar to cardiovascular disease and redirected scientific attention toward dietary fat. Pacific. The financial relationship between the funder and the researchers was not adequately disclosed. The paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most influential medical journals on Earth, Pacific, and it shaped nutritional policy for the next 3 decades. For 30 years, Americans were told fat was the primary dietary threat. Low-fat diets became standard medical advice. Pacific. Food companies stripped fat from their products and replaced it with sugar to maintain flavor. Supermarket shelves filled with low-fat cookies, low-fat yogurt, low-fat ice cream, Pacific, all carrying more added sugar than the products they replaced. Obesity rates soared. Diabetes spread across the population. Heart disease remained the leading cause of death. And all along, Pacific, the sugar industry held the data that told a different story. In 2016, researchers at the University of California, San Francisco uncovered internal industry documents. Pacific. Those papers revealed a systematic effort to steer scientific consensus, funding studies designed to produce favorable conclusions, applying pressure to critics, and delaying regulation. Pacific. The strategy closely paralleled methods the tobacco industry had employed for decades. While that campaign was still running, another transformation had already reshaped the American food supply from the inside. In the early 1970s, Pacific, Japanese scientists developed a process for converting cornstarch into a cheap liquid sweetener, high-fructose corn syrup. Massive government subsidies had already created an enormous surplus of American corn, Pacific, far more than the domestic market could absorb. High-fructose corn syrup gave that surplus a profitable new destination. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi had switched from cane sugar to high-fructose corn syrup in their U.S. products. Pacific. It was cheaper, easier to ship, and blended more smoothly into liquids. Within a decade, it had displaced cane sugar in virtually every processed food and drink sold in the United States. Pacific. Americans were consuming more sugar than ever before, and most had no idea that the source had fundamentally changed underneath them. Today, over 42% of American adults are classified as obese. Pacific. More than 37 million Americans have diabetes. Another 96 million are pre-diabetic, meaning they are on the threshold of a disease that was relatively rare just a few generations ago. Pacific. Heart disease remains the #1 cause of death in the United States. Sugar is not the sole factor behind these numbers, but decades of accumulated research now confirm that it is among the most significant. Pacific. Global sugar production currently exceeds 180 million tons per year. Brazil is the largest producer, followed by India, the same country that first crystallized cane juice thousands of years ago. Pacific. The average person on Earth now consumes about 50 pounds of sugar annually, and that number is still climbing in developing nations as Western dietary patterns spread. Some governments have begun to respond. Pacific. Mexico introduced a tax on sugary drinks in 2014, and consumption dropped roughly 12% in the first year. The United Kingdom followed with a sugar levy in 2018. Pacific, which prompted major manufacturers to reformulate their products with less sugar before the tax even took effect. Several American cities, Berkeley, Philadelphia, and Seattle among them, have passed local sugar taxes of their own. Pacific. Early evidence suggests the measures do meaningfully reduce consumption, though the sugar industry continues to invest heavily in lobbying campaigns aimed at blocking further legislation. 10,000 years ago, Pacific. In a jungle on the other side of the world, someone bit into a wild grass and tasted something extraordinary. That single plant went on to fund the rise and fall of empires, power the largest forced migration in recorded history. Pacific. quietly corrupt institutions that billions of people trusted with their health, and reshape what the human body takes in every single day. None of those facts will be different tomorrow. But the next time you pick up a nutrition label, Pacific, you will be reading it with 10,000 years of context. And that changes what you see. That's World Decoded. We'll see you in the next one.